to take us through managing leaf-feeding insects and mites in the nursery industry. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, John.
And like I say, if any questions, just write them down as you think of them. Don't leave them till the very end, because you're likely to forget them. Okay, go for it, Andrew.
So yeah, we did have my phone drop out randomly for no apparent reason. So if I drop out again, I'll ring back in. It'll be okay, but John will take over for a moment. But anyway, yes,
hopefully.
Managing leaf feeding. Yeah, that's right. So we're talking about managing leaf-feeding insects and mites. And just briefly, first, the overview of this webinar is to have a brief look at the project under which it falls. And then we're going to talk about sucking and chewing insects and their management. So firstly, this project is part of a bigger project. This webinar is part of a larger project, rather, producing fact sheets, pest management plans. It's a levy-funded project. We make available to you subsidized diagnostics, so you can send us sick plants. We work out what's wrong with them, what's not wrong with them, send you some results back and how to manage those problems, or come up, work out a way to work out what the problem is, because sometimes we don't find anything. And we also run workshops in each state and territory, and these webinars, these webinars are made available on the FMS, the Nursery Production FMS website. And if you haven't been to that website, you should have a look. There's a lot of resources available to you that are really very good. So we also then assist NGIA or GIA as they're transitioning in various pest and disease related items from a sort of corporate point of view. Okay, so without further ado, let's get stuck into it. There's a lot of stuff in this webinar, a lot of information. We're going to go through it relatively quickly. And thankfully, in some ways, you probably are going to be aware of most of these insects and mites, but perhaps not all of them. So firstly, we're going to go into some of the types of damage that you've seen or not seen, and how to link the symptoms that you might be seeing or might see in the future to the type of insect or mite that could be causing it. So, probably seen this sort of stuff. Deformed damage, it can be caused by a whole range of insects, mainly your sucking pests. So leaf curling, unusual growth, it's quite common. You can get galls, again, different type of deformity, and also with this slight sort of corky tissue. Sometimes leaf-feeding insects will just produce unthriftiness. It almost looks right, but it's not quite. What is going on there? In this case, there were scale insects, and just as that expands, you can see the scale insects they're just tiny. But if you've got a keen eye, then you can find them. Sometimes you have phyllodes. So phyllodes is when you have small leaves, and a huge number of insects, particularly a sucking pest, can produce that phyllodes. Again, here, this on the right hand, we've got two different types of pests. You've got your spider mites causing your chlorosis, and area-fired mites causing the cup galls and the Aranea, which you can't really see them without a microscope, but it's lots of little hairs. Okay, again, spider mites. This is what you'd call leaf stippling, rather. Just little tiny chlorotic dots. So if someone says, or if you're talking to an entomologist and you get leaf stippling, this is the sort of thing that they mean. You can also find on the right-hand side here, all this white snow is the cast-off skins of the mites. If you look carefully, you can see a couple of actual individuals, but the majority of what you're seeing there is just the cast-off skins, whereas the beetle is actually a good guy. It's a predatory beetle, and yeah, you want to keep those ones. Okay, some more types of damage. So this brown sort of corky tissue is leaf russeting, or almost like a rust. And whereas the insect is very small, these are thrips, immature thrips. The leaf curling, of course, is another type of damage. Other types of damage you can get from leaf-feeding insects, sawflies are just removal of tissue. Sometimes your stink bugs or other sucking pests will just cause dieback, but then you get chewing insects that also do it. Okay, so if you have leaf skeletonizing, they'll tend to just remove tissue so that you only have the mid veins and the other ribs. Beetles will often do that. Caterpillars, other chewing insects can do that sort of thing. This isn't obviously an extensive. We're just going over briefly the types of damage that you can see to introduce the topic, basically. So here are flea beetles, as the name suggests, and as you can see with their back legs are quite big, like a grasshopper, similar at least, and they can jump. And given how small these insects are, they can jump 5-10 centimeters. When you consider it's only a 2 or 3 mil organism, it's pretty impressive. And as you can see in the background, this is out of focus, but there's a beetle here, and it's producing all this damage, and you can only really find one individual. So it can be a little bit cryptic. Other types of damage. John, if you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute, that'd be pretty good. And so the caterpillars here, you've got some silk, leaf curling, leaf miners, and we'll talk about some more of these insects as we go through the webinar. Now, what is tricky is that each one of those types of damage, it seemed fairly obvious when you put it in a presentation like this, but it's not always straightforward. So perhaps you could write who thinks they know what has produced these leaf curls. And I'll tell you there are different organisms, vastly different organisms. So type in there what they think it is, and if you can,
I even got one of these wrong myself, so don't feel embarrassed.
Yep. Anyway, I'll keep on talking as they've come in. Different organisms produce the same symptoms. And oftentimes these organisms have very different management strategies. So it's always important to open them up, have a look in detail as to what is causing that problem. Otherwise, you might implement the wrong strategy. So, John, what did we get? What sort of guesses did we get?
We got spider and caterpillar from one attending.
Okay, so caterpillar is one of the organisms. All right, and but the spider is wrong. So the one on the left is actually
we've got caterpillar and beetle from another one. So caterpillars, yeah, but yeah.
Yep. So there are some aphids. So if you open that up, and you can sort of see how it's produced a little bit of white substance on there. If you open that up, you would find aphids versus a caterpillar. Obviously, if you open it up, you'd be able to recognize it. So it's worth not making assumptions. We've been places where they go, oh yeah, we've got spiders on these plants. And in actual fact, it hasn't been spiders, but it's been caterpillars. So it's not always obvious until you have a look. So we can link symptoms to the causal organisms. So chewing insects tend to produce these types of damage. There are always exceptions. Biological systems. If I said these are the only ones, no doubt you could find more. But the big ones that you would think are only caused by chewing insects are these ones that are coming up in red. So if they produce holes, they're removing leaf tissue, they're skeletonizing, they're causing leaf windows or leaf mines, you're almost undoubtedly dealing with a chewing insect. Some chewing insects will also cause dieback or leaf rolling or produce silk or deposit frass. They'll, even very small caterpillars, they can feed on the new growth, and the new growth can then unfold, expand, and be a little bit deformed. They can produce galls, but so can some sucking insects. So the main chewing pests that you're going to get in a nursery are caterpillars, beetles, and fly larvae. The fly larvae aren't technically chewing insects, but they're not really sucking insects, so they more fit into the chewing side of things. Less common would be your sawflies, grasshoppers, stick insects. Hopefully you don't have to deal with those too much. Now, one important thing you've got to keep in mind is that sometimes you get other organisms that remove plant tissue that are not insects. So raise your hand if you have dealt with like rabbits or rats or something else that's sort of a little unusual. A couple hand raises there. Wow, that's more than I expected, actually.
Yeah, looks like everyone nearly.
Wonderful. All right. Well, hopefully you're able to then recognize the sorts of damage caused by your vertebrates versus the ones caused by insects. And really, there's no replacement for your experience with the crop and in your growing area. So now when we talk about sucking insects, the damage is actually a lot more diverse, although it sort of looks similar sort of list. But deformity and unusual plant growth is such a large array of different symptoms that you can get. We just presented a few of those types of symptoms. Galls are the same. The array of different types of galls is amazing, and sometimes those galls can even be beautiful until the plant's unsaleable. Phyllodes, russeting, so your leaf chlorosis. So some of these types of damage you'd expect to only find sucking insects to produce. So if these ones in red, you would expect only from your sucking pests, except perhaps when you're dealing with some of the leaf miners that will produce a necrotic area. We'll touch on that later. Okay, and you can see the types of organisms producing these damage is quite long. And what makes it even more difficult is that non-pathogenic disorders can often produce similar sorts of symptoms. So who's seen a nutrient deficiency? And sometimes you go, oh, that's a nutrient deficiency, but actually it's an insect pest. Has anyone found? Okay, yeah, a few of you are raising your hands. That's great. So it can be tricky to disentangle these things. All right. Do we have any questions at this point? I know it's only a short section, but it sort of builds the foundation for the rest of the workshop.
I think one of the things that came through when we were asking about what other pests, invertebrate pests, Andrew, you were talking about, we had an interesting one about king parrots causing some damage.
Wow, okay.
I know they're a beautiful looking bird. They are a beautiful bird to look at, but yeah, I've never actually thought of them as being a pest in a nursery situation.
I guess in that sort of a case, if they are specifically going for one type of crop, you'd be potentially thinking about sticking them under shade cloth or some way to deter them from coming to them. So we'll talk about some of those management options later on. Certainly when we consider that the production nursery industry is in every corner of the country with vastly different climates and different organisms, then we're going to come up with some unusual things causing damage.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, we'll continue on as Yep. So this next thing was we're going to look at the approach to identify your causal agent or your pest. And then we're going to talk about some of the chewing insect groups and the sucking insect groups. And it's going to be pretty quick, but we can spend more time in certain areas than others. And we'll ask you to type in the main pests that you get. Well, you can do it now or you can do it in a moment. Now, who has a microscope? If you just raise your hand, that would be great. Okay, yeah, a couple of you. Okay, that's great. Microscopes can be invaluable, particularly for the smaller insects and also mites. There's no substitute for careful observation. So when you first find something is wrong and you've never seen it before, or even if you have seen it before, you need to have a close look. Looking at the foliage with a hand lens, that's a good first start. If you can see something and you recognize it, that might be all you need to do. But if you can't see anything and the damage maybe looks like it could be a mite or thrips or any number of other small organisms, then you need to look potentially in the new growth, take a plant, stick it under either the, cut off the tip or take the whole plant, look at it under the microscope. These microscopes don't cost that much these days. This one was from eBay, but there are probably other platforms where you can purchase these sorts of equipment. What I like about a system like this, it's relatively inexpensive, about $400. This one had 7 to 40 times zoom. You can have some microscopes that have a larger zoom, so go to a higher magnification, but you really don't need much more than about 40. You can see broad mites, you can see areophyte mites, and that's really as small as you're going to be able to get, unless you get something a lot more powerful and they'll be more expensive to be useful. Hopefully you can get one with a camera attached. This one has one, and then that can hook up to your computer and you can take some images with it. The quality of the images, all depend on the camera, but it's always going to be better than nothing. This one also has a light source. Some don't have light sources. That's okay, because really going to Officeworks and buying a $20 desk lamp will do the job in most cases. Just a digital LED. Sometimes they even have multiple settings. Pretty cheap. I would recommend getting one from an Australian supplier. As soon as you start buying some of this equipment from overseas, well, they're not covered by Australian consumer laws, and you're not as likely to get good support. So you can do it, and sometimes you'll be just fine, but my recommendation, Australian supplier. So hopefully with a microscope, you can find the actual organism, and you do need to look in the new growth, look at the foliage. Sometimes you need to dissect the plant out. So you can see the type of damage. You can get an idea of the types of insects or other causes that might be impacting your plant. And then you can dissect out. So pull back the leaves. So here you've got on this plant here, this little chlorosis. It's not grossly damaging the plant, but it can affect the salability. And you can see the organism here. That's an immature thrips. You can see these little critters are some of the adults. So they're feeding underneath the leaf sheath. So as the foliage expands, it's increasing the damage. Sometimes you need to cut the stem. Depending on the damage, will affect the extent to which you dissect the plant. But certainly look in the growing tips, look under leaf sheets, particularly for your grass type plants or anything that is in that sort of a grass-like structure. Looking under the leaf sheets is important because there are heaps of insects that will stay under there and produce really massive damage from a very protected area. It can be important to observe the plants at different times of day. Some insects will be present during the morning or night, and obviously it's difficult to look at plants at night, but there are methods to work out if there's an insect at night. sticky traps, or you can try and rear insects out in just a small cage. We've seen people use 2-litre Coke containers. You can just cut a little hole in the container, paste or glue on some mesh so that there's some aeration. A Sealy's All Clear was the best one that I've tested. It really sticks very nicely compared to some other ones where the mesh will just pop right off. You can send plants off to an expert, to diagnostic labs. If you've got photos, they're great to send and to get some initial feedback. What you also is worthwhile doing is making sure, particularly if you cannot find an insect, make sure the damage isn't being caused by something non-pathogenic. So a nutrient deficiency, the pH or the EC of the growing media of water. You'd be surprised the number of times that we come across a plant problem and it's actually related to pH and EC. And even for people, they'll go, oh no, it's right. Now, my growing media is perfect. Keep an open mind. I can't stress that enough. From the diagnostic lab point of view, where we're in the lab, we try and keep an open mind as much as possible because we are constantly coming across things that are outside of the norm. And it's very common to find that something unexpected has occurred in the production system. Okay, so once you have a suspect organism, don't just assume that it is the causal pest. You do have to make sure you don't turn your brain off. Our brain is our most important tool. So I'm not sure if anyone actually has seen a book louse, but you can see them on plants relatively frequently. And as soon as you start beating your plants, who knows what I mean when I'm talking about plant beating? Just raise your hand. Okay, a couple of you. Great. So we'll cover that a little bit more in a moment. That's good. But you will find stuff on your plants, and they're not necessarily a problem. They're just on the plants because it's a substrate on which insects like to sit, and they can be feeding on dead and organic matter that's not affecting plant growth. They can be feeding on fungi that's not impacting plant growth. It's just part of biological systems. So you get a suspect organism, look at your tools and see if you can identify it and whether or not it's something that actually is causing that damage. And if you're not sure, yeah, definitely send photographs. Okay, so if you haven't done so already, please type in the types of organisms that you consider to be the most troublesome at your nursery.
We had one, Andrew, and it seems like spider mites and scale insects are probably a few of the more common ones. But they also mentioned lacewings. So lacewings are a beneficial insect. Yeah, so I guess don't get them confused with when you see an insect that you need to do something about it. Lacewings are your free workforce. They're helping you control a whole range of small, soft-bodied insects that you might have in your nursery. So keep a good eye on them and harbour them. Yeah, keep them going.
That's true. Although if there's a market access problem, particularly if they're being sent to, let's say, WA from the other states, then potentially, it must be a sterile plant. Anyway.
So we've got caterpillars, mites, two-spotted mites, broad mites, xerophides. So it looks like mites are the top of the board.
All right, lovely. Thank you, John. What we'll do is we'll spend a bit of time going through these groups, a little bit in terms of the biology of these things, and then we're going to cover the management side of things all at once at the last portion of the webinar. So caterpillars, they've got chewing mouth parts. Probably most people would recognize that. They're removing plant tissue. They've got 3 pairs of legs and prolegs. So these prolegs are these fleshy sort of suction cups. There are 5 or fewer prolegs, you're dealing with a caterpillar. If it's 6 or 7 or more, then you're dealing with a sawfly. Sometimes caterpillars have the urticating spine. So urticating, so if it's means like itchy. Sometimes these urticating spines actually are associated with a poison gland. That poison gland will deliver. They can be like hypodermic needles. So in the case of the cup moth, give it some respect. If you grab that thing, it's really going to hurt. Other caterpillars, most people will have seen a hairy caterpillar, I'd imagine. It might not be associated with a poison gland, but it still can cause irritability if they sort of stick like slivers into your skin. Okay, so some species spend daylight hours in the mulch or in soil, and will just come out at night to feed. And this is important from the management point of view, which we'll cover later. And again, sometimes caterpillars will pupate in the soil, and sometimes they'll pupate on the plant. And that has important implications as well. Excuse me. So, the adults generally don't feed, or if they do feed, they'll feed on nectar, or pollen. Very rarely are adults feeding on plants, the exceptions being your fruit-piercing moths and things like that. So the types of damage you get from caterpillars: leaf removal, leaf mines, leaf curling, stem borers, cutworm species will also cause a dieback. They can be pretty devastating, particularly in your grass species. What's important to understand with caterpillars is that the largest larvae consume the most food. So the eggs are laid, the neonate, the first instar larva that comes out, it eats hardly any food. So it removes hardly any plant tissue. So first and second, when they molt, they've only molted a couple of times, the larva is relatively small, they don't eat very much food, but as soon as they hit about third instar, they start consuming more. They molt again into fourth instar, they're eating exponentially more. And the last instar, they're consuming a huge amount of food. And they can, who's seen a hawk moth larva? Just raise your hand if you've seen this sort of a larva. And they can be pretty large insects. Yep, okay, there are a few people raising their hands, thank you. And they'll just chow down on those leaves and they can just, where'd that plant go? In very short order. Now, obviously, most caterpillars aren't that big, but if you get a few caterpillars, and some will actually aggregate when they're little, and perhaps even when they're larger, they can really chow down, and this has important management implications. You want to get them when they're young so that fewer plant material is eaten. Anyway, I've been working on the pest management plan. It's almost out, and there'll be more information on caterpillars. Oops. Here we go. Next slide is coming. All right. Leaf miners. There are a lot of different groups that, well, at least a few groups that cause leaf mines. We're not going to talk about these individually. What's important to realize is there are different groups that cause leaf mines, and this has implications for the way they're managed. There are two types of symptoms. You have your tunneling type symptoms, and then you also have your blotch type symptoms. And that doesn't necessarily tell you what group they belong to, because you can have some beetles that will do blotches and some beetles that will do tunnels. I'd imagine that's probably similar, but I'm not sure if sawflies ever do the tunneling types. You'd have to look that up. But it's important, you have to open it up, have a look at the larva, or rear out that individual. And you can see them, like in this picture here, you can see that there is an immature stage here. So if you get your leaf, perhaps you'll get a fly coming. Well, in this case, it is a fly, and a small fly might fly out, or the pupa might drop to the soil and pupate, but you can still rear out the individual to get an idea of what type of organism it is. Okay, so we've covered that. Okay, beetles. Beetles the larvae can look superficially similar to caterpillars, 6 legs, chewing mouth parts. They do not have prolegs. So if you see something with prolegs, you can automatically go, it's not a beetle, it's going to be a caterpillar or a sawfly larva. They sometimes do have a suction pad at the end. The larvae are generally soft-bodied. And there is a lot of variability in the way they look. Some will look very similar to caterpillars, others will look, you wouldn't recognize them as a beetle larva necessarily. The damage is similar to caterpillars, so they'll remove the leaf material, they'll do leaf curls and mines, stem borers will produce dieback, and it's important to realize that some species are predators. It's relatively common to get a beetle predator, and the larvae can be predaceous too. So your beetles, recognized quite distinctively if you see an insect and it has this very hard covering where the wings are. This is actually the forewing, and it goes all the way down to the end of the abdomen. You can go with a high level of confidence, that's a beetle. Now, if you start to see a window or a clear, transparent area towards the bottom, and you see sucking mouth parts, then you go, okay, that's not a beetle, even though it can look superficially similar. They can be small or relatively large. They can feed on the leaves, stems, fruit. We're talking about leaf-feeding insects, but they do also, some beetles will feed on roots, as you well know. There is a leaf beetle fact sheet, and there's a boring insect fact sheet coming out soon. So we're going to keep on moving because there's...
And that's not boring as in not very interesting, is it?
Well, you might argue, but right. Boring as in it's drilling through. Thank you, John. All right, so your sawfly. Sawflies, who has sawfly issues? If you just raise your hand, who's had problems with sawflies in the past? Not seeing any hand raises, a couple of hand raises, okay. They can often aggregate, they can look very similar to caterpillars, they can appear slug-like. So you can see the sawfly is right in this section here. That the individual is there. Damage, again, it's generally leaf removal. Oops. All right, I'm not going to spend any more time on Fungusgnats unless anybody raise your hand if there's other information you want for them. Okay. All right, so we'll move on to Fungusgnats. Fungusgnats, the eggs are laid in the top part of the growing media. The larvae can be quite cryptic. They're small, opaque, and really the main distinguishing feature is this black head. It sort of almost looks like a fingernail. One important aspect of their biology is that they inhabit the top layer of the media, and they prefer wet environments. So the main thing with Fungusgnats in terms of their management is keeping it dry and removing the organic matter. And really, if you do that, most likely you won't have a problem with Fungusgnats. They're mainly a problem in propagation. Light damage can induce a failure to thrive. You know, they're feeding on some of the leaf hairs. If you have large larvae and large numbers of large larvae, they can, tunnel up through the stem, cause massive problems. They can spread fungal diseases, which can be problematic in combination with damaging the roots and then, leaving a wound for a pathogen to enter and then bye-bye crop. Okay, there is a Fungusgnat pest management plan. I'd recommend getting a hold of that. It is probably one of the most important pests that can be managed quite easily biologically and with cultural management control. You shouldn't need, if you're having to put on massive amounts of pesticides, you really need to examine your cultural management practices to see if there's something that you can change. Oops. Here we go. I'll just get to the next slide, which is thrips. So they are very small. Who raise your hand if you'd recognize thrips? They are, obviously very small, 0.5 millimeter in length occasionally. Okay, that's great. So most people can recognize thrips. If you don't recognize thrips, it's probably worthwhile having a look online, looking at the pest ID tool to see what they look like and become more familiar with them. In real life, they can look like a speck. But with practice, you'll be able to recognize them. You beat your plants, you'll see a small organism moving around. You go, oh, that's a thrips larva, or immature stage, which are generally yellow to orange. Okay, adults tend to be light or dark brown, sometimes black, sometimes with some white sections on their body. So they're feeding. They tend to have macerating type mouthparts, and then they suck up the cell tissue. They're often in the new growth. They're often in flower buds and in concealed areas of the plants. The damage is a little bit delayed for that reason. So they'll be feeding in the new growth. Then that growth unfurls and you see the evidence of the damage that was actually a little while ago. So it's an example of a reason to keep monitoring so that you pick it up early. They can also produce leaf rolling, galls, silvering, or russeting of the leaves, flowers, stems, and some species will transmit various viruses. In the nursery industry, probably tomato spotted wilt virus is one of the most important from that respect. And there is a Thrips pest management plan and a fact sheet available. Oops. Aphids, again, a pretty important pest in the nursery industry. If you're not familiar with aphids, there are some aspects of the biology which can assist your understanding of how they can become such a big problem seemingly overnight. So most species are all female, so they don't need to mate with a male, and they don't even lay eggs the vast majority of the time. They just lay, or they're called the larviposit. The larvae then will molt a few times and either turn into a wingless individual or a winged individual. The winged individuals tend to be produced when the plant starts to decline or when there's a really dense population of aphids. Obviously, if you have a lot of winged individuals in your crop, it means they've been around. Well, if you see both the wingless aphids, a lot of wingless aphids, and a lot of winged aphids, it means they've been in the crop for a fair while, and those winged aphids are going to fly to other areas, potentially in your crop, and reproduce more. Whereas if you only are seeing a few winged individuals, let's say you've been beating your plants and you see the winged individuals, then you can expect that you're going to have little colonies of aphids starting very soon. Okay, so the damage tends to be leaf deformation, leaf curling, galls. A lot of aphids can transmit viruses, honeydew, black sooty mold. You're probably all familiar with these sorts of things. There is an aphid pest management plan. There's an aphid fact sheet. There's a green peach aphid fact sheet. One other important aspect with aphids is that, particularly on your native plants, the aphids tend to be fairly host specific. The vast majority of the species are fairly host specific, but there are a few species that are also very common and widespread and feed on a lot of different plant species, which green peach aphid is one of them. So knowing the host plant can help you with the identification, and that can be important not just for aphids, but for some other species of, let's say, of thrips that can be resistant to certain pesticides if you're using pesticides. So it can be important to know what species you're dealing with and to send them off to a lab so that you can then have a chance of recognizing the type of aphid that you're dealing with. Okay, scale insects. So scale insects, although they are mostly circular, ovoid, and have a bit of a waxy layer, they're quite a diverse group of organisms. Scale insects include mealybugs, it's just one family of scale insects. They all have a very similar biology in that they lay eggs, which are often, for these type of scale insects, the eggs will just be laid underneath the female. The eggs hatch into a crawler stage, and as the name suggests, the crawlers crawl. Once they molt for the first time, they tend to be sedentary, so they don't move any more than that. There are a few groups of scale insects, however, that can move after they've molted. So with biological systems, there are exceptions to the rule. Now I'm going to need to keep moving because I'm conscious of the time. They feed on the growing tips to form the new growth, cause leaf spots, chlorosis. They can cause stems to be encrusted, which cause dieback. Black sooty mold attended by ants, and sometimes they actually produce galls and they can look like worm-like organisms. Quite interesting, actually. There's a scale insect pest management plan. So what this webinar really is just a taste of, this is the variety. Now you find out what you've got, and hopefully you can tap into more information. So as per the previous slide, pretty much the same sorts of issues with mealybugs, often underneath the leaf sheath, as you can see here. I'm going to keep on moving. Whiteflies can look similar to scale insects in the early stages, but then of course the adults they look like white flies. Entomologists, not necessarily all that imaginative, perhaps. I'd propose to you that if you have an infestation of whiteflies and you touch the crop and all of a sudden you see snow flying up into the air, which are the whiteflies, you might need to work on your monitoring program so that you pick up the whiteflies early. Because the low infestations are easy to miss. And so like scale insects, the crawlers move, the nymphs are sedentary, but the adults fly around. A range of symptoms: leaf chlorosis, silvering. Sometimes you get early leaf death. They can vector viruses. Sometimes some species will produce a lot of waxy type secretions that can look like snow on the leaves. And there is a whitefly pest management plan for more information. Okay, other sucking insects can cause a range of symptoms from chlorosis, the stippling, dieback, which is a Rutherglen bug, stink bugs. We've seen in an earlier slide with dieback when they're feeding on the growing tips. We can't cover everything. We're going to move to mites, and we're at the last few slides of the individuals before we start individual groups, before we get into the management section. So I'd say most people would be familiar with this sort of thing. What is important to realize is that they generally have a fast development time. Small numbers of insects, or small to medium number of mites rather, may be easily missed. They can reach a critical mass where they lay heaps of eggs, and the eggs can be there in large numbers. Those eggs hatch, the nymphs then start to feed increasingly, and all of a sudden, there can be a massive adults produced, and the silk can just go everywhere, and you can see this sort of thing. So it is important, particularly with spider mites, to be monitoring and finding the populations early. So beyond the leaf stippling, webbing over the leaf, if you get a large enough population, you're going to get the leaves dying and falling off, that sort of thing. There is a mite pest management plan for more information. Now, broad mites, are one of the very few mite species that you can identify with the microscope that we had pictured earlier. If you see an egg like this, a white polka dotted egg, you can be sure that you're dealing with broad mites. So here are the unhatched eggs, and they're relatively easy to see. So if you have had an old population, you can actually still find these hatched eggs, and you can have an idea of that you were dealing with a broad mite issue. Now, they inject a toxin into the plant when they're feeding, and they tend to be in the growing tips. So you can manage them, let's say, with pesticides and get rid of them with the broad mites, but you may still have some residual toxin in the plant which may still produce the damage. So this is a type of organism that you really need to be on top of, looking at your stems and foliage. If you see that damage, find the mite before you but certainly before you spray a pesticide. Make sure that you're spraying with the right product and that you're not just spraying the plant for no reason. Okay. The damage can be similar to a variety of other organisms: mites, thrips, phytotoxicity, nutrient deficiencies, plant growth regulators, aphids, a number of other things. So it's important to get it right. Area fired mites are similar. They're even smaller than broad mites. You cannot see them with the naked eye. With a hand lens, you're going to really struggle. Even knowing what we're looking for with a hand lens, it can be very easy to miss them. For mites, they're quite unusual in that they only have 4 legs. So if you look at this mite here, you can see 4 legs, and you can see it's splaying out its legs. This one here is trying to catch the wind. So this plant, which if this is on tomato, it was loaded with mites, and there were some that were doing this sort of thing to try and catch the breeze and be blown away. Area fired mites are small enough that they can be taken up into the atmosphere. Water droplets do not crystallize inside them because they're too small. So they can pretty much just drop out of the sky and luck of the draw whether they land on a plant that they can survive on, because they are quite host specific. They'll only feed on maybe one species or a small number of closely related plant species. So knowing the host plant species can indicate what species of area fired you're dealing with. They can be at low numbers without damaging the plant. They are small enough that you can take your cuttings, propagate them, and propagate your problem very easily. The damage can be similar to broad mites in terms of this deformed growth, but different species produce different types of damage. So sometimes they'll produce a finger gall or a cup. The Aranea, which is the pink hair-like growth. Who's seen pink hairy growth on a plant? Sometimes it's slightly orange, particularly sometimes gum trees and some other native plants. Just raise your hand if you've seen that sort of thing. Yep, at least 1 or 2. If you see pink hairy growth, it's quite distinctive. Most likely you're dealing with an area fired mite. And if you put it under a microscope, put the heat on it, then you'll start seeing them crawl out of that Aranea. You can also get that russeting or the rust type look on the stems and fruit and leaves. Okay, do we have questions? Now, that was a huge amount of groups to go through in a very short period of time. But
we did have one request, if we could just talk a little bit about rearing insects in a nursery situation, so that if somebody wants to know what they've got, how they can easily do that in their own nursery.
Okay, so it depends on the plant, how big it is. If you're dealing with a relatively small plant, it can be pretty easy. So you have to be a little bit creative. If the plant's small, you might be able to use a 2-liter Coke bottle or a 1.5 to 1.5, a smaller bottle, and just stick it over the plant, put on a bit of a mesh so there's some aeration. Then you can watch it grow and see if the insect comes out. you could potentially stick paper or a card or laminated paper on the base of the plant so that it covers the growing media. And that way, if the organism drops out of the plant, it's easier to see. Sometimes insects aren't necessarily all that smart, very clever. Their life cycle is very complicated, but sometimes they're not that smart, and they'll maybe even just pupate right on top of that bit of paper. If they're in the growing media already, then potentially you can stick it in a cage. It's actually not that hard. You can buy insect cages online if you do an entomological supply search or just search insect cage. You can grow your plant in that. What I'd recommend is putting it in a place that someone will be looking at it relatively frequently. If you have an office staff member who's interested in that sort of thing, it's perfect. Or in your own office, it's just as long as it doesn't get neglected. And you'd be surprised how easy it is to forget about it and then not know what happened.
I guess with leaf-feeding insects, you could put them in a container and just keep feeding them leaves and have that in one of those insect cages as well.
Absolutely. So it does depend. So if you want more information, one, you can contact us if you Google Grow Help, or you can just Google it or do a web search, I should say, to find out more information. All right, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to keep on going. But
we
certainly
did have one. Yeah, we did have one about predators for aerified mites, but I think we cover that in one of the slides that's coming up. So we might leave it for that one.
Yep, perfect. That sounds good. Okay, so we're managing leaf-feeding insects now and looking at preventing entry, reducing pest pressure, and the importance of monitoring. Now, before we get into that, let's look at some questions that are important, particularly when you're dealing with something that you have never experienced before, that you have no information on the biology of that organism. They're the sorts of questions you want to ask are, where are the eggs laid? What time of year are the eggs laid? What part of the plant are the juveniles occupying? What sort of damage do they produce? Where do they pupate? Where do they rest and feed? So some organisms will rest during the day in the soil and move onto the leaf during the day, or potentially even vice versa. They'll go to different places. So if you get an idea of the life cycle, and then you also think about what stage is doing the damage and when does that damage become critical. If you put those sorts of things together into a puzzle, you may find that, okay, one particular organism, it will tend to increase in number. The pest pressure will start to occur in spring. But if it lays the eggs and the first bit of feeding then deforms the leaf and makes an unsaleable plant, then you know you need to manage that pest before the eggs are laid, or have the management strategy as the eggs are present, and really make sure that you focus on that prevention. Otherwise, you're behind the 8 ball the whole time. So then hopefully you break the life cycle and you control that key stage before the unsaleable damage occurs. So that's the take-home message. So these sorts of strategies are the things that you can be putting in place, and you'll have to tailor it to each of those specific groups. So preventing entry is important. Obviously, if you prevent entry, you don't have to deal with the problem. So the quarantining and inspecting your incoming stock is critical. If you're not doing that, then I highly recommend it. You will reduce problems no end. Propagate from healthy stock. This is basically the same thing. Manage your mother stock like it's gold. Look at the health of the mother stock a month, 2 months before you know you're going to need to take cuttings. Insect-proof structures can be a bit tricky, but they can be excellent in certain cases. Sometimes even just shade cloth can reduce the number of insects moving into it. Hitchhiking pests, keep your machinery clean, your secateurs, I mean, that's more a disease thing, but you can spread pests, diseases on your machinery. If you have a car park and you're designing a nursery, keep it separate from the rest of the nursery so that you're less likely to move insects on your vehicles into the growing area. Windbreaks can sometimes work, but particularly for weeds, it's good. Only use your clean, well-composted media and talk to your supplier and see how they manage their fungus gnats. Start your management of fungus gnats early. Have it dry and covered. Grow resistant tolerant plants. There's a whole slew of insects out there that will only feed on certain plant species. And if you just change the species, perhaps it's functionally the same, you can get rid of a problem. Keep your growing areas clean. The number of times you'd be surprised, a small insect can survive on a leaf that's almost dead. Scale insects are a case in point where your crawlers can survive on that organic matter that's fallen onto the ground. It doesn't take that much for it to get onto a plant. It's motivated. It wants to survive. So they'll move, and sometimes it only takes a small number to get back into the crop and reinfest it. So break the life cycle, keep your growing areas clean, disinfest your growing areas from time to time, particularly depending on the risk involved with that crop and your growing situation. Remove unsaleable plants. This sounds like a patently obvious recommendation, but you'd be surprised how often we see that not occur. Problems just compound. Good spacing is important. It keeps a healthy plant. It facilitates good pesticide penetration. A lot of different pests, particularly your scale insects and various other groups, they love it in that dense, moist environment, and it just improves their chance of damaging your plants. Zero tolerance for weeds. A lot of insects will feed on weeds and then jump into your crop. It also provides, it's a problem from just the pure weed point of view as well. I mean, you want to sell the plant, not the non-plant. I mean, the weeds are plants too, but you know what I mean, I'm sure. Grow plants optimally. You'd be surprised how that seems pretty obvious as well. A healthy plant can withstand the damage, more damage, or more insect pressure, I should say, and is more likely to recover from the damage. Encourage your naturally occurring predators with banker plants. So don't grow weeds, because weeds can also harbor your predators, but banker plants, so plants that you've tested with different species for your growing area, hopefully suited to the types of plants that you grow, so that you get your predators in. And you can talk to companies like Biological Services and Bugs for Bugs to get recommendations, but you probably will need to tweak it for your nursery. Manage your pests proactively, and that really comes down to your monitoring. If you don't know it's there, you can't react to it. You can't respond to it well. And this is just an illustration of me beating some plants. So I'm tapping the plant material onto the plate. That's actually like those old taco type plates. Doesn't have to be anything special. It can be an ice cream bucket, a folded up piece of laminated paper, anything which is one color, preferably sort of white or even black sometimes is really helpful for contrast. Play with it, find out what works for you, your eyes, different from other people's eyes. See what moves. You'll pick up thrips, whiteflies, aphids, sometimes scale insects, beetles, caterpillars, anything that can fall off the plant and can be knocked off relatively easily will go onto your beating tray, and then you can look more closely. You'd be surprised how easy it is to find spider mites and those organisms, and you go, wow, I can't see where those spider mites are just by walking past the crop sort of passively. But when you start turning over leaves, you go, wow, they're there. So the monitoring will reduce your management costs, even though it seems like it takes time. So you shift your activities from reacting with pesticides to monitoring and being proactive. It takes a bit of time to really get this working well, sometimes even a couple of years. But those people that have done it see the benefits in the product that they sell being healthier and are reducing pesticides. And as time goes on, that is going to be increasingly important. Monitoring is also important from knowing that your plants are consistently healthy. It's helpful for establishing your biological control programs. It's very important for establishing whether your control measures have worked. So if you know that you've had a pest problem before you apply your pesticide and afterwards they're gone, there's a fair chance that your pesticide application worked. Whereas if you don't know that you had an insect present and you spray a pesticide, you don't know if you had a problem to start with or not. You don't know if your pesticide application worked and it was that pest, or if it just was environmental conditions or some other factor and it just changed coincidentally at the same time. You'd be surprised how important that is. And the monitoring can help you keep your growing conditions optimal. You can find your problems early, obviously, and respond to them early so that you don't lose stock. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'm really conscious of the time being 11. So I'll whiz through this. There are an increasing number of biological control agents available commercially. I really encourage you to pick up the phone, talk to your suppliers. There's a whole range of them. Besides Biological Services and Bugs for Bugs, they're the two largest ones in Australia. There are other providers, and if you do a web search of biological control producer or beneficial insects, you can get to the Good Bugs webpage, and it lists all of the different companies that are producing different insects. You can get consultants to your property in most areas of the country now, and they can help you establish these programs. There is a new product for area-fired mites and broad mites through Biological Services. It's in the testing phase. It's promising for the management of those pests. Most of the other biocontrol agents available really don't have an impact on area-fired and broad mites. So if you're interested in that, contact Biological Services. Don't underestimate the importance of the naturally occurring predators. So the more you spray pesticides, the fewer predators and parasites you're going to have in your crop. And use the fact sheets and pest management plans that are available to help you with product choice as well as management in other ways. So overall, implement as many management actions as possible. Monitor your crop, identify your pests early, use the resources available, and develop some management actions specific to your business, and get help where you need it. The production nursery industry in Australia is one that it's at the top of the food chain in terms of the resources that are available to you. You're not alone. You don't need to remake the wheel. You can get help where you need it to progress through the complication quicker than you otherwise would. Any questions, John?
You actually covered the one on the mites or beneficials for area-fieds, which is good.
Yep.
One thing that I'm confused about myself, did we actually, or have you produced a fact sheet on borers?
It's coming
boring
soon.
insects.
We're currently working on it. Yep.
All right. Yeah, because I did have a question from Lee about that. So sorry, Lee, I have given you the bum steer on that one. So that's on its way.
Shame on you, John.
Yep.
Boring insects are a pretty challenging a group of insects to deal with. If they are consistently a problem, one must really ask the question, can I get away with not growing this plant? It's harsh, but if it is a massive problem, they're very difficult to manage with pesticides. I'll just throw that out there.
And we did have one, with regards, if the grower themselves can't identify the insect, whether it be a bug, beetle, whatever, can they contact us for assistance? And absolutely.
Yes.
If you're able to take a photo of your insect pest, send it to us via email. If we can't identify it, we will ask somebody who may be able to help us in identifying that particular insect for you. So by all means, send images to us, or if you want to, preferably not send live ones, but yeah, images are great as a starting point for identifying various things.
What we'll be doing is sending out an email either this afternoon or tomorrow, covering some of the main points, pointing you to some of the important links, let's say the Production Nursery FMS website, the fact sheets and pest management plans. You'll then have our email, and you can send us and get in contact with us in the future. If you're looking at this on YouTube, then just do a web search on Grow Help Australia. It will come up towards the top of the list, and the email address is on our webpage. I think that's it, John.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending. This will actually be on the Nursery Industry Association's YouTube channel in the near future. So if there are other members of your nursery that would like to look at it, it may take a week or so before it gets up there, but it will be there along with a lot of other webinars which we've produced over the past few years. So feel free to access them. They're a great training tool for your staff and probably a good refresher for yourselves from time to time as well. So once again, thank you for everyone for attending. I hope you got a lot out of today, and we will see you next time we have another webinar. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.